you ever noticed how just the sheer amount of news we get every day about the Middle East, especially, Iran and Israel, it's still incredibly easy to feel, well, overwhelmed.
Oh, absolutely. The headlines change so fast, the history is so complicated.
Right. It's tough to get a clear handle on what's really going on. Today, we're doing a deep dive into a really fascinating and I think incredibly insightful book from back in 2010. It's called The Sixth Crisis: Iran, Israel, America, and the Rumors of War by Dana Allin and Stephen Simon.
Yeah, very timely read, even now.
Exactly. So our mission today is to unpack the key insights from this book. We want to understand how these authors, writing, almost 15 years ago, saw this unfolding crisis.
And why they called it a path to disaster.
Precisely. And maybe most importantly, what lessons from their analysis still hit home with real relevance today.
And the core idea, the thing that frames the whole book, is this concept that the Iran situation wasn't just another issue. It was actually the sixth distinct crisis that pulled America deeper and deeper into the Middle East since World War II.
Wow, the sixth.
Yeah, and they argue each one had these lasting, often pretty damaging effects, both on U.S. policy and, the region itself.
Okay, let's unpack that then. Because like you said, they don't just jump right into Iran. They carefully set the stage, detailing 5 crises before that. These crises really shaped America's deep and often, let's face it, difficult involvement over there. They talk about this accumulated trauma for U.S. foreign policy.
It's a powerful phrase.
It is. So the first crisis they point to is the Suez Canal crisis back in 1956. President Eisenhower made this key decision basically to protect America's global image.
Right, and it stopped that secret British, French, and Israeli plan in its tracks.
Yeah. But the book notes, while it maybe humiliated our allies, it didn't really stop the rise of Arab radicalism in the long term.
And that's the crucial insight there, you see. Even when the U.S. acted decisively, it often had these unintended long-term results. It sort of deepened the entanglement without fixing the root causes.
It set a pattern. Okay, then we get the second crisis. This stretched over 7 really turbulent years, from 67 to 73, bookended by 2 Arab-Israeli wars.
A critical period.
Yeah, this is when the U.S. essentially took ownership of that conflict, siding much more overtly with Israel, and of course facing that brief but pretty impactful oil embargo. The authors really stress how America became the central player then.
Undeniably.
Then the third crisis hits hard in 1979, the Iranian Revolution. Now, this wasn't just the Shah falling or the awful 444 days the American hostages were held in Tehran.
No, it was more foundational than that.
Right. It also led to the declaration of the Carter Doctrine, which, by the way, put the U.S. military commitment to the Persian Gulf on a completely different level, a commitment that's incredibly still shaping things today.
And you also saw the rise of Iranian-backed terrorism during that time, like the horrific 1983 bombing of the Marine barracks in Beirut.
Killed 241 U.S. personnel. Just devastating.
What's so vital there is how that crisis just fundamentally shifted the power balance in the region. And it introduced this new, persistent challenge of state-sponsored terrorism directly hitting U.S. interests. It really cemented America's direct military footprint.
Okay, crisis number 4, 1990-1991, Iraq's invasion of Kuwait. This one's interesting because, according to the authors, it kind of felt like a moment where U.S. power actually went right.
Yeah. The first Bush administration did skillfully put together that huge global coalition against Saddam Hussein.
Ejected Iraq from Kuwait pretty smoothly, it seemed. But what's the deeper takeaway there, according to the book?
Well, it looked like a clear win. The authors kind of hint that maybe it created a bit of overconfidence.
Yeah.
About how effective military force could be in solving these really complex regional problems.
Like it was an exception, not the rule.
Possibly. It was sort of an anomaly in a long history of much messier issues, and arguably didn't prepare the U.S. for what came next.
Which brings us to the 5th crisis, emerging after 9/11. This covers the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. And the authors, they frame this pretty bluntly as a strategic failure for the U.S.
They do. And they specifically point to President George W. Bush's Axis of Evil speech.
Why that speech in particular?
They argue it basically abandoned the fundamental strategic principle that it is better to divide one's enemies than to combine them. Lumping Iran in with Iraq and North Korea wasn't strategically wise, in their view.
Okay, so if we connect all these dots...
You see how each crisis, no matter how it was handled or what the immediate result was, it just pulled the U.S. deeper in.
Without really fixing the underlying issues.
Exactly. This accumulated trauma, as Ellen Simon called it. That's what President Obama walked into. That's the backdrop for what they call the sixth crisis.
So what does all this history mean for you, the listener, trying to grasp the rumors of war back then and maybe even now?
Well, it means understanding that these aren't just separate incidents. They're all connected, threads in this long, complicated story that shaped the situation Obama was facing with Iran.
Okay, so let's get into the core of it. This is where it gets really interesting. The heart of this sixth crisis the book focuses on is Iran's determined push for a nuclear capability.
Right, and the book lays out the situation as it was back in 2010, and it was pretty stark.
Yeah, by 2002, intelligence knew about secret construction that uranium enrichment plant at Natanz, the heavy water facility at Iraq, later confirmed by the IAEA, the UN's nuclear watchdog.
And there was evidence Iran was also working on designing a nuclear warhead.
And the UN Security Council had already repeatedly judged Iran's program a fundamental threat to international peace and security. The authors are clear. Iran's uranium enrichment program is indisputable and undisputed.
And crucially, by 2010, Iran already had enough low-enriched uranium that, if they enriched it further, could make at least one nuclear weapon.
They'd crossed what some people were calling the point of no return.
So this was obviously a serious, very real development. But what the authors really dig into is the why, the complex web of reasons behind Iran's actions.
Right. It's not just one simple thing.
No, not at all.
The book looks at Iran's motivations, seeing both defensive and, well, offensive drivers. On the defensive side, there's that incredibly traumatic 1980-88 Iran-Iraq war,
where Iraq used chemical weapons.
Yes, and the authors say the world showed general indifference, and Iran perceived the U.S. as basically condoning it.
And then there was the downing of the Iran Air Flight 655 by the USS Vincennes in '88.
Which many Iranians saw as deliberate. The book says it convinced Ayatollah Khomeini the U.S. was siding with Iraq and had, quote, decided to finish the job itself. Deep-seated fear there.
Absolutely, but it wasn't just fear.
No. There's also this offensive or maybe prestige motivation. Iran's regime was, as the book puts it, puffing itself up as the avatar of Islamic radicalism.
Drawing on anger about the Palestinian situation, resentment of Israel's nuclear monopoly.
And its leaders were using this annihilationist agenda rhetoric against Israel. So it's this mix, right? Real fear, historical grievances, but also this ambition for regional power, ideological leadership.
Which raises a really tough question. How do you even assess the rationality of a leadership like that? Especially given the internal politics the book describes.
Yeah, the authors warn against assuming it's simple or that everyone in charge thinks the same way.
In fact, they point to the chaos in Tehran after the disputed June 2009 election. They said it led to a kind of paralysis of Iranian decision-making.
Making it even harder for other countries to engage.
Exactly.
So Iran's push towards this nuclear capability was creating, what was that phrase the expert Sam Gardner used in the book, an excess demand for military action in Israel?
That's it. You could just feel the pressure cooker building.
Okay, so turning to Israel, the book describes this real sense of panic, a deep gut-level conviction that a nuclear Iran is an intolerable threat to Israel's actual existence.
And this isn't just talk. It's rooted in their history.
Right. The authors talk about the Holocaust and how Israelis living in that long shadow have little patience for those who parse the Iranian statements in terms of political rather than physical destruction.
For them, the fear is existential. The book says the belief is that chasm under inaction is death.
Wow. And this thinking gets reinforced by their history, right? Israel's past preemptive strikes.
Like hitting Iraq's Osirak reactor in '81 and a Syrian facility in 2007.
Yeah, those actions seem to prove that hitting first can be, as they put it, a reasonable approach in a hostile world.
And what's important for you, the listener, to get is that this wasn't just talk either. Israel had the means to act. The book goes into their capabilities.
Absolutely. Back in 2010, they had advanced F-16s, F-15s, the range, the refueling capability to reach targets like Natanz, Isfahan, Iraq.
And the bombs to do the job.
Yeah, those specialized bunker busters, BLU-109s, BLU-113s, designed to penetrate deep underground facilities like Natanz, which was buried under, 23 meters of soil and concrete?
Plus precision guidance, GPS, laser-guided stuff, they could hit accurately.
But connecting this to the bigger picture, the authors stress that even with that capability, a big air attack like that would be incredibly complicated and highly risky.
Huge downsides, far beyond just hitting the targets.
What were the main risks they saw?
Well, first, just getting there, the overflight issue. You'd have to fly over other countries, Syria, Turkey, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Iraq. Some hostile, some just unwilling.
And flying over U.S.-controlled Iraqi airspace, that sounds tricky.
Extremely diplomatically awkward, the book says.
Yeah.
And risk a potential deadly clash with American air defenses if things went wrong, if they weren't properly identified.
Okay, what else?
Then there's the question of how much good it would actually do.
Yeah.
The impact would likely be limited, probably only a temporary setback, maybe 6 months, maybe 5 years, they estimated. Iran could just rebuild, maybe even more determined.
And casualties. Propaganda.
Big risks there, too. Potential for hundreds of civilian deaths, maybe a release of uranium hexafluoride gas, which, as the authors note, would lead to inevitable propaganda exploitation by Iran.
And finally, the relationship with the U.S.
That was critical. A huge potential strain, especially if President Obama had specifically told Prime Minister Netanyahu not to attack.
And Netanyahu himself. His UN speech in September 2009 really drove home that existential threat feeling.
Yeah, and an advisor even mentioned he saw Iran as a kind of modern-day reincarnation of the Amalekites, this ancient sworn enemy from the Bible, a heavy sense of historical duty.
So you can really see how Israel's internal view, rooted in these deep historical fears, was putting immense pressure on its most crucial alliance, the one with the United States.
Absolutely. A collision course seemed possible.
So with Israel feeling this intense pressure, let's look at President Obama. He takes office, inherits not just this immediate crisis, but all that accumulated trauma we talked about.
Right, and he wanted to shift U.S. foreign policy, move it in a different direction.
Driven by what the authors call psychological realism. What do they mean by that?
Basically an understanding and intuition that the U.S. couldn't just force its own story, its own view of history and morality onto the rest of the world. It had to engage differently.
So his initial approach included things like that Nowruz message, the Persian New Year's greeting to the Iranian people and leaders, trying to be conciliatory.
But Supreme Leader Khamenei basically brushed it off, called it the continuation of old accusations. Didn't really land.
Then came the big Cairo speech in June 2009. The authors call it an act of rhetorical audacity.
Yeah, aiming for a new beginning with the Muslim world. And in that speech, he directly called for an Israeli settlement freeze. Stated very clearly, the United States does not accept the legitimacy of continued Israeli settlements.
Which immediately surfaces this really difficult linkage dilemma.
Ah, yes, the linkage problem. A major sticking point between Washington and Jerusalem.
Tell us more about that. What was the disagreement?
Well, Obama's view, basically, was that making progress on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict was essential. It was needed in order to enlist Arab support for a strategy of containing and pressing Iran. Solve that core issue, you get more leverage on Iran.
Makes sense. But Netanyahu?
He pushed the reverse linkage. He argued, no, peace talks are impossible until Iran had been contained. You have to stop Iran first, curb its support for Hamas and Hezbollah, then maybe you can talk peace.
So a fundamental disagreement on sequencing.
Exactly. Now the authors, they look at this and say, okay, maybe direct hard linkage is tough to prove. But there is an indirect linkage.
How so?
Addressing the Palestinian issue, they argue, can reduce resistance to other forms of U.S. influence. It lowers barriers to Washington's message on other things, like Iran's nuclear program. So it's this incredibly tangled mess where everyone agrees something needs to be done, but they can't even agree where to start.
Okay, what about sanctions? That was a major tool being discussed then. The book mentions debate over tougher but targeted sanctions, especially hitting the IRGC, the Revolutionary Guards.
Right, but there were real doubts about how effective they could actually be.
Why?
Well, the authors point to examples like the U.S. embargo on Cuba, which yielded no obvious results beyond adding to the general impoverishment. Plus, you had Russia and China.
Right, they weren't playing ball.
Not really. Because of their energy interest, maybe some resentment over NATO, they had refused to go along with real game-changing penalties.
And there was another concern, too, wasn't there? About the Iranian people.
Yeah, that harsh sanctions might just directly punish the Iranian people and actually undermine the Green movement, that reformist surge happening after the 2009 election, which some saw as a potential positive force.
So given all these roadblocks, the linkage issue, doubts about sanctions, internal Iranian politics, what practical options were actually on the table, according to the experts cited in the book?
Well, the book highlights a few things. Some missed opportunities, some pragmatic ideas. There was that grand bargain idea floated back in May 2003.
What was that?
Basically, a proposal apparently from Iran. They'd limit their nuclear program, curb terror support, if the U.S. lifted sanctions and recognized Iran's security interests. but the Bush administration just ignored it.
A mischance, perhaps. What
Right.
else?
Then there was this tantalizing fuel swap deal that nearly happened in late 2009. The idea was Iran ships most of its low-enriched uranium to Russia for more enrichment. Then it goes to France to be made into medical isotopes.
That sounds promising.
It was described as much more hopeful news, but it ultimately fell apart. Too complex, too much mistrust.
So what was left? Any other alternatives?
There was this concept called managed acquiescence. Figures like Thomas Pickering, Stephen Miller supported it.
Managed acquiescence. What does that mean?
Essentially conceding Iran's right to enrich uranium on its own soil, which Iran insisted on, but under the strictest possible IAEA supervision. Maximum oversight.
How was that viewed?
The authors say it was seen as not very attractive, but maybe preferable to any remotely realistic alternative if the goal was just to buy time and avoid a war.
So it's really clear that while Obama definitely wanted this foreign policy reset and even made moves like adjusting missile defense plans with Russia, the reality on the ground, especially with Iran, was just incredibly tangled, full of these deep political and strategic knots.
Absolutely. No easy answers anywhere.
Okay, so beyond the main players, Iran, Israel, the U.S., the book also looks at the wider region. It describes the kind of Arabs' Cold War going on.
Yeah, full of these deep fears and constantly shifting alliances.
What was the core fear for the Arab regimes, particularly in the Gulf?
Just a palpable fear, the book says, that Iran's hegemonic ambitions will be strengthened through nuclear blackmail. They were really worried about Iran becoming the dominant power.
And this also showed up as concern about Shiification.
Right. That was the term used. This worry about Iran trying to spread Shi'arabism, religious and political influence across the region. You saw that in comments like King Abdullah of Jordan's warning about a Shia crescent back in 2004.
Okay, then there's this intriguing idea of a tacit Israeli-Sunni alliance. What do the authors make of that?
Well, they acknowledge there's a measure of truth to it. Israel often claimed Arab states were secretly on their side against Tehran because they shared that fear of a nuclear Iran. But they also call it wishful thinking because those same Arab regimes are also terrified of their own people, the destabilizing passions of their own populations, as the book puts it. Populations often angry about the Palestinian situation and Israel's own nuclear weapons.
So they might worry about Iran privately, but openly siding with Israel. Politically impossible.
Exactly. It's a very tricky balancing act for them.
Iran's actual influence, its proxies, are a huge part of this regional picture.
Oh, absolutely critical.
Yeah.
Iran was in a strong position in Iraq after the 2003 U.S. invasion, thanks to the new Shia-dominated government there.
And Lebanon.
A deep umbilical connection to Hezbollah. Iran provided weapons, money, making it a major player in the resistance to Israel's existence.
And Hamas in Gaza.
Iran was a patron there too, though the book notes that Palestinian feelings about Iranian influence were more ambivalent, not always straightforward support.
So this complex web brings us back to that critical question the book keeps circling. What happens if Israel does attack Iran?
Right. And the authors paint a really stark picture of the likely fallout, spreading far beyond just Iran.
What are the main risks they lay out?
Well, first, almost certain Iranian retaliation. They could hit U.S. bases in nearby countries or target assets or even people in the Gulf Arab states, which would probably lead to an even bigger U.S. military presence.
So escalation.
Definitely. And wider regional instability. The conflict could easily widen to encompass Lebanon, maybe triggering another civil war there, giving a tremendous boost to groups like the Muslim Brotherhood.
Via terrorism.
They warn about further mutations of the global terrorist virus as a plausible consequence.
And the economy. Oil.
Huge economic impact. Spiking oil prices, Westerners potentially fleeing the Gulf. It could cripple any global economic recovery that was happening.
And what about broader U.S. goals?
It would profoundly undermine them. It would kill Washington's efforts to engage the Muslim world, fuel anti-Americanism, and, ironically, probably undermine the Green movement in Iran by making Iranians rally around the flag against an external attack.
So their conclusion on war is pretty bleak.
Extremely. They write, "The rumors of war are growing more insistent, and this war, we are convinced, will be different." They argue it would be momentous, changing the whole region in ways you couldn't predict based on past wars.
No simple solutions.
None. As they say, there are no simple solutions. But there are bad options and disastrous ones.
Wow. Okay, to wrap up our deep dive, the authors offer this really interesting look at the power of words' presidential narrative and how it shapes policy and global views. They draw some fascinating comparisons between Obama and earlier presidents.
Yeah, it's a great section. They highlight how Obama consciously tried to reaffirm and reestablish an American consensus against torture, for instance.
And to fix what he saw as a poisonous narrative about America, especially in the Muslim world.
Right. That Cairo speech, again, they called it audacious in its rhetorical ambitions. He even quoted the Quran, the Talmud, the New Testament, trying to find common ground for peace.
How does this compare to how they saw other presidents using rhetoric? Like Reagan?
They see Reagan as someone who really changed the moral discourse by speaking plainly. Evil empire, tear down this wall. And they note his readiness to trust Gorbachev's good intentions was also key. Words backed by a willingness to engage.
And Kennedy.
JFK is praised for his coolness and wit and seemingly easy eloquence and his capacity for insight, especially during the Cuban Missile Crisis and in his American University peace speech. That speech laid out a really realistic path towards coexistence with the Soviets. His words helped reframe the whole problem.
But George W. Bush's rhetoric post 9/11.
They see it differently. Phrases like axis of evil, ending tyranny, balance of power that favors freedom. While bold, they argue it ultimately failed to resonate.
Why not?
Because, the authors argue, his words just fed into a pre-established narrative of hostility and mistrust among many Arabs, partly because of things like the Iraq War and the torture policies. The context mattered hugely.
So this really shows how deeply embedded these historical narratives are.
Absolutely. It makes political solutions so much harder when each side basically demands the other accept its version of history before they can even talk peace. Obama's efforts, however inspiring, were bumping up against these really deep currents of grievance and mistrust.
And you see that perfectly in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict itself, right? The competing narratives.
Totally. You have Israel demanding Palestinians recognize Israel as the national homeland of the Jewish people. For Israelis, the book says this represents their whole struggle, their warfare, which should logically lead to peace.
But for Palestinians?
Their demands often focus on the right of refugee return, which for Israelis sounds like asking them to admit their country was founded on a monstrous injustice. They're fundamentally different starting points.
And the authors also stress how the trauma of the Holocaust shapes Western understanding and support for Israel, adding another layer to these narratives.
That's undeniable.
So the book makes it pretty clear. Words matter, rhetoric matters, but they can't just magically change things on their own, especially when you're dealing with such deep-seated historical conflicts and political realities.
Right. Words need to be connected to action, and even then, it's incredibly difficult.
Okay, so after diving deep into the sixth crisis, it seems abundantly clear that back in 2010, the authors saw absolutely no easy fixes regarding Iran.
No, they really emphasize that. They saw only bad options and disastrous ones.
And specifically, an Israeli attack on Iran.
They argued it would likely be a tragic mistake, just immense strategic costs, spiking oil prices, wrecking U.S. efforts to connect with the Muslim world, probably rallying Iranians against the attackers, undermining the Green Movement, setting back the peace process even further, just a cascade of negative consequences.
But interestingly, they didn't completely rule out the military option, did they?
Not entirely. Their preferred path was containment, but strengthened by much clearer U.S. security guarantees to both Israel and Arab allies, making it absolutely unmistakable that if Iran ever did use nuclear weapons, it would trigger overwhelming American retaliation against the regime itself.
So deterrence, not necessarily prevention through attack.
Exactly. Make the cost of using a weapon unbearably high.
And there's one more core insight, maybe the most important one.
I think so. It's that dealing with the Palestinian issue, resolving it, or at least making real progress, is a fundamental American interest. They call the conflict a moral and strategic hemorrhage for both the United States and Israel.
And fixing it or working on it?
They argued it would considerably lighten, if not completely end, America's strategic burden in the region. It could even allow for a potential mellowing of the Iranian regime over time by removing a key source of regional tension and Iranian leverage.
Wow. So it really leaves you thinking, doesn't it? If that was the situation in 2010, the sixth crisis, defined by Iran's nuclear drive and the seemingly intractable Israeli-Palestinian conflict, with the authors fearing a path to disaster.
Yeah, how much have those core dilemmas really changed in the nearly 15 years since?
And maybe more pointedly, what historical lessons, the ones laid out so clearly in this book, are still seemingly unlearned as we continue to navigate these persistent rumors of war in the Middle East today?